Welcome back to the Renk Seas of Innovation podcast. I'm your host, Max Renk, and in each episode, we dig into the tools, strategies, and agronomy that help you get more out of every acre. Today, we're taking a closer look at inoculants, how they work, why they matter, and the role they play in preserving grain quality and boosting animal performance in the end. I'm joined by Jesse Thompson, microbial product manager at Arm & Hammer, along with Alex Renk, who's back to break down how inoculants fit into your operation. From the history of inoculants to today's use of adding bacteria to our soil, we're covering everything from pH drops and bacterial strains to application best practices and how inoculants can protect your ROI. Let's get into it. And today I'll be sitting down with Alex Renk, who is you've heard across our past episodes, and Jesse Thompson from Arm & Hammer, and I'll give them a opportunity to introduce themselves and why we're talking about inoculant today. We'll start with you, Alex.
So I actually was responsible for bringing an inoculant into the Renk seed portfolio. And so I'm also the marketer and kind of resident expert.
And go ahead, Jesse.
Jesse Thompson with Arm & Hammer, product manager for microbials. A little history of myself, 16 years of microbiology experience in a lab, exploring microbial solutions, better understanding challenges within the ag industry. And within our lab, we do a lot of research relative to mini silo testing and understanding inoculants and how they function.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And so today we're going to be covering everything about inoculants, from their history and how we put them to work now, as well as how we break them down and identify different families of inoculants. And then we'll kind of end with the do's and don'ts of using them. So I think we'll kind of start with the history here. So Alex, why don't you talk about that and our linkage to alcohol, which has been present through the rest of human history.
We look at inoculants as some people might think of as this is kind of a new technology. It is kind of not really the case. It really dates back to basically the foundation of our civilization because it's really tied into alcohol. And when you look past fire, the wheel, alcohol has been a huge thing for civilization because alcohol allowed you to basically have drinking water that could get nasty, full of yeast, bacteria, diseases, and it would actually protect you against those. And alcohol, its basic format is just taking plant juice, can be anything, as you probably know if you drink enough alcohol, and adding yeast, and that yeast will actually convert some of the sugars in the plant into alcohol, and then that alcohol is a great preserving agent as far as keeping bad things out. So once ancient man figured that out, that was a huge thing because suddenly a lot of the world opened up because there's very little clean water. And if you want any sort of population in a certain area, you need to have clean water. And then all of a sudden you can take liquids and turn into alcohol, and that will keep you safe from dying from all nasty diseases that are floating around in water.
Perfect. And then, Jesse, what do you think that link is now as we moved from alcohol to, plant-based inoculant or bacterial-based there?
Yeah, I like Alex's summary and thinking about alcohol as an antimicrobial to inhibit pathogens, preventing diseases, and taking that same concept of microbial end products, we bring that over to the silage inoculant world where beneficial bacteria can actually produce acids, lactic acids, to drive down the pH to preserve that silage. And if we do this in a rapid manner, we can prevent dry matter losses and making sure that we're preserving a high quality level of silage to that dairy cow. And in that same manner, if we're dropping that pH quickly, we're preventing the outgrowth of pathogens, much like alcohol is antimicrobial to pathogens on the water side, to make sure that we're not contaminating this feed that's going to have a detrimental impact on that dairy cow.
Perfect. And I think that's a great way to pivot here. Let's talk about how preventing dry matter loss and some of the byproducts of why we care about inoculants and what it does for our animals.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about inoculants preventing dry matter loss, what we want to do is produce lactic acid in a rapid manner to rapidly decrease that pH. And with that rapid decrease in pH, you're preventing a lot of other bacterial organisms from degrading, proteolytic activity breaking down nutrients that essentially is wasting dry matter within that silage material. So the quicker that we can do that, the less dry matter loss we're going to see.
Perfect. Alex, do you have anything to add there?
what we're doing with the inoculants is we have some very selected bacteria families that are designed to outcompete yeast, outcompete natural bacterias in the soil, because all natural bacterias are not good. The prime example, like probably everybody's seen that, like in their science classes, watching a mouse decay under like the high speed decay over time. I think everybody's seen that.
Yeah.
And nature is a good way of recycling everything, so if you leave something dead, it is just going to disappear. So what we're trying to do here is, instead of it disappearing into the environment, it actually stays as intact as the digestible food for cattle. I know with yeast can compete with bacteria down to about 5.5 pH. They can compete with the bacteria, but at that point, a lot of the oxygen's gone with using our bacterial inoculant, and the amount of lactic acid is so much that the yeast cannot compete. So you kind of take the yeast out of there, so you're not making alcohol, you're making feed.
Okay, so now that we have kind of some of the understanding behind the inoculants, I guess I'm looking for some information on how both our cattle and cow farmers can benefit from using our inoculants here.
Both can benefit on the dairy side and beef cattle side. So it's all about preserving the most quality nutrients possible. Both dairy and beef cattle will utilize those nutrients maybe in different ways. If you think about the beef cattle side, you're looking for improved efficiency, improved average daily gain, where on the dairy side, you're looking for more nutrients that can be utilized to be captured in way of milk production.
So now we've talked about the animal performance there. I guess what do we see from the actual grain harvesting and seed planting we see here, Alex?
So when you cut that crop is basically as good as it's going to get. It's dead. It's all downhill from there. So what we're trying to do with the inoculant is quickly drop the pH so that other yeast can't get going, other bacteria can't get going, and preserve as much as possible. And that's dry matter. That's basically it's energy use. If you have heating in your silage, that means that's energy being used. So I look at inoculants as maximizing your acre rate of return, because you only have so many acres, and don't you want to maximize what you're producing at your acres?
Yep.
I think inoculants pretty important that way.
So, okay, on that note, as we expand upon our inoculants a little bit more, I know generally they fall into two different families. And I guess looking to you here, Jesse, is what are the differences between the two of them, and why do we care about the differences?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two main buckets when we think about inoculants. Homofermentative inoculants, which is all about that front end rapid pH decline, preserving the nutrients, reducing dry matter loss like we previously discussed. And then those heterofermentative inoculants, and these are throughout the fermentation process, converting lactic acid to acetic acid. And acetic acid is antifungal. So during the feed out phase, this is going to control the outgrowth of yeast and molds and everything that's utilizing the nutrients with that silage to increase the shelf life and make that feed stable longer. So homofermentative, you're really looking to reduce losses on the front end of that fermentation. Heterofermentative, you're really looking to reduce losses on the back end.
What's kind of some disadvantages and advantages of both of them? I know you just captured the beginning and end, but are we looking at anything else in between?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if you think about heterofermentative inoculants, during that stable phase, we ran a lot of mini silo trials monitoring these VFA profiles, levels of lactic and acetic acid throughout that fermentation process. And as we see the fermentation process progress, we see that lactic acid being converted to that acetic acid. So you think about a Lactobacillus buchneri based inoculant. This is creating that conversion to give you that antifungal activity in the back end. When you think about homofermentative, a lot of that activities happen up front. And then once you get to that stable phase, things are fairly static and not a lot's occurring until oxygen is re-exposed. And then you can have losses in the back end. But like Alex mentioned earlier, if you can control that yeast outgrowth on the front end, you can gain back end benefits. Maybe not directly like a heterofermentative inoculant with acetic acid production, but rapid pH drop will prevent yeast outgrowth on the front end to increase aerobic stability on the back end.
Because we're seeing most of the complaints would be on the back end would be open face bunkers.
Okay.
Where they're just not keeping up with the exposure to the oxygen on that open surface. That's where the products come in play, in that you can keep those yeasts out of control. Otherwise, you have spoilage, or you would start having some health problems with the cows because they're getting fed spoiled feed.
So we kind of see ones that focus on the front end and the back end. And I know that there's stuff on the horizon of trying to mix the two. I guess that innovation, what's holding it back right now from coming into actual commercial use?
Yeah, so you could mix homofermentative, heterofermentative strains. In the case of Renk Seeds inoculant line, looking at HMC 780 and 790, they both have the Pediococcus pentasaceus, which is having front-end impact relative to decreasing pH, and then the Buchneri, which is a heterofermentative strain, helping on the back end. But when we think about the focus and the target inoculants, it comes back to a CFU per gram of bacteria that you're putting onto that feed. And you don't want to dilute one strain or another too much so you can maximize the benefits that you're getting based on your challenge.
So right now we're kind of running into the fact that you can't really have both your bacteria competing over the same pot, correct?
Yeah, I mean you could, but at what cost? Obviously, there's an economic return on investment to the end user, so we want to target that approach to provide the most value to show the ROI to the producer that we're working with.
And we usually target Buchneri, usually goes more towards the silage route or the high moisture, whereas some like the 340, the 370s, 320s, that goes more to the haylage side.
Yeah, and typically when you see the high moisture corn, the corn silage, typically you have more challenges relative to the feed out phase and the yeast growing and causing aerobic stability challenges. So yeah, it's a good fit.
I guess one thing I also wanted to bring up was another benefit of these products is that they can take some of the more highly undigestible parts of the plant and get them ready for the animal. And so they break down some of the cellulose, which we couldn't digest at all. Theoretically, cows can't digest, but they have the rumen, they have the bacteria in their stomach that can do it. And so we're kind of doing a pre-digest for the cows using these products. Kind of harkens back to my days in college. I got a lab job. My first day of my lab job was to take cow manure, grind it up, and then do analysis on it for what was actually in that passed through the cow. So that's how they figure some of this digestibility for animals, and especially cows. They're very complex because they have the rumen digesting. They also have some what we would consider regular digesting going on all inside that little cow, and then recording what's going in and what's going out. And yeah, that's the job, is to grind up cow manure and figure out what was left over.
And Alex, that's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up. I was at the 4 States Nutrition Conference. Dr. Luis Ferreretto from the University of Madison presented some research relative to how inoculants are helping improve NDF digestibility and compared to control feed, showing an improvement in that digestibility and how impactful that is for dairy producer profitability.
Seeing that we have lots of results coming from our inoculants here, let's talk about some of our application process and the do's and don'ts of using them, as well as our dry versus wet and how that factors in. And I think just for a wave top level here, let's talk about the wet application at the chopper and what that's doing for us through our process there.
We have both products. So you could put dry on. Nothing wrong with dry. The only problem is that you're talking 50-pound bags. You got to throw a lot of material in. Whereas I rather use liquid application where it kind of drips into the chopper, a lot less headaches. Nice thing about our product is that we have some safeners in there. So if you don't use that whole tank, you got a couple days to use it. It doesn't turn to sludge, where other products do not use that safener.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to make sure that those bacteria are getting inoculated onto that feed alive. Otherwise, they're not going to have the functional benefits that we would anticipate from applying those inoculants. So the functional carriers to preserve the viability, as well as keeping those bacteria in a safe place, right? You don't want to leave the inoculant on the hood of a pickup truck for a day baking in the sun. We want to make sure those bacteria are getting onto the silage alive. So a combination of functional additives and good management practices is crucial to get the end result you're looking for.
You have live bacteria. And the best case scenario is they stay frozen until they're ready. Once you start adding heat, bad things can happen. So keeping it cool, keeping it stored properly until you're ready to use it is very important.
we got the application there, but how is that functioning whether that's through liquid or dry? How are we actually affecting our silage as we're chopping it?
Thinking about the functional carriers and trying to make those bacterial strains viable, what can we do? And a lot of people, when they think about inoculants, they don't think about what extra could we put in these inoculant packs to make those strains live in various conditions. So with the Renk inoculants, what we're doing is there's 3 functional carriers, sodium bicarbonate to prevent the curd formation within the tank. There's another ingredient that's binding free chlorine molecules within chlorinated water. And then there's also a third element that's binding free moisture within that inoculant. And all these functional carriers are acting to preserve and make sure those bacterial strains are staying alive before they're getting applied and mixed in the tank.
Sure, because we don't want our inoculant to be dead before it's actually used.
It's not pretty when it's dead.
No.
So let's kind of talk about the process of what we're looking for. The ensiling process, kind of start to finish. We talked a lot about it at the front end and the back end.
Yep.
But how are we going to, what does that look like from start to finish?
Yeah, so typically the fermentation process is looked at in 4 different phases. So you start with the aerobic phase. So just a fancy word to say that oxygen is present. So as we start breaking down some of those simple sugars via inoculants or natural bacteria, we're utilizing oxygen within that silage. So once all the oxygen is utilized, you're starting to enter the fermentation phase. So this is in anaerobic conditions, again, a fancy word of saying there's no oxygen present. And this is where the inoculant strains can really take hold and start driving the fermentation and producing lactic acid in a rapid manner to start decreasing that pH. So typically you have different strains in bacterial inoculants, the Pediococcus, which function better at a higher pH, which are really kickstarting that fermentation and driving down that pH to a threshold. And then you have strains that function better at low pH that are really Lactobacillus plantarum that are going to high producing, really efficient at producing lactic acid. And this happens to a point. It varies by crop. So if you think about haylage has a higher buffering capacity. So typically you're shooting to get below a pH of 5. With corn silage, you see a lot lower pH. Typically you're shooting for a pH below 4. And once you cross this threshold and no longer any nutrients to be utilized, this enters what we call the stable phase. At this point, not a lot's occurring. Within the heterofermentative inoculants, you'll see some lactic to acetic acid conversion. But at this point, it's fairly stable. Nothing's really happening until the feed-out phase, when you're opening those bunkers or piles and oxygen's reintroduced.
And so let's say, what if the first phase there, what happens when we have a lot of extra moisture introduced there and you got some, we'll call it high moisture corn?
Yeah, so if you have a high moisture environment, or let's say you have higher dirt or ash content within that silage, this is a more favorable environment for bacteria to grow that negatively impact the fermentation. One that comes up typically within the fermentation world is Clostridia. So Clostridia are common within soil, so increased ash content. Typically, you get a higher level of Clostridia. They tend to grow in wetter environments, so higher moisture within that crop. They're going to be more prone to outgrow. And people might not always recognize Clostridia, but they'll probably recognize butyric fermentations, right? So you see the end product. Everybody's touched that silage that you pick it up, it smells horrible, you throw down the silage, but it sticks in your hands for like 2 or 3 days afterwards, right? You keep smelling it. So as a way to mitigate this response, dropping the pH faster helps. And once you get the pH below a 5, depending on the moisture content, the Clostridia is no longer able to grow. So you can prevent the outcomes such as butyric acid fermentation. And that's how most inoculants approach inhibiting the growth of Clostridia. Now, Where Renk Seeds inoculant line differentiates is with the MT550 CL. So that has a unique bacterial strain in it. So it's a bacillus strain that can actually produce antimicrobial peptides that will directly inhibit the growth of Clostridia. So not only are you fighting those Clostridia challenges through a rapid pH decline, you also have another bacterial strain that's directly competing with Clostridia to prevent their outgrowth and reduce or prevent butyric acid fermentations.
And that can be huge. But I think the big thing to remember is that Clostridium comes not only from feed, but it can come from other sources on the farm.
And that's kind of what you were talking about, Jesse, with the ash content, correct? Where you'll see it.
Yeah, high levels in soil, we'll see it a lot.
Yeah, moisture is always good for bacterial movement because it greases the wheels for stuff to move around readily, and that's why you have problems when you have high moisture.
Yeah.
It's a good medium for moving stuff around.
Yeah, and if you think about what triggers bacterial growth, there's really three primary elements, right? The pH, the environmental conditions, moisture, bacterial needs moisture to grow, and temperature, heat, and nutrient content. So they need nutrients to grow. So those are really the big drivers of what's promoting that bacterial growth, specifically the pathogens like Clostridia.
So basically, as much as a inoculant has conditions they're growing in, that's when it's competing with the other bacteria and to really do its job to kind of fight our pathogens we don't want to see in our feed.
Correct.
And why don't we address a little bit, if we don't use inoculants, what does the ensilage process look like?
Absolutely. And we probably have users out there that aren't currently using an inoculant, but lactic acid bacteria are native, they call them epiphytic populations within plant material. So they're naturally there. So even if you're not using an inoculant, you will see that same fermentation curve of reducing pH. However, in some cases, challenge cases, you won't see that pH decrease as fast or as low that you're at higher risk for butyric acid fermentations, increased dry matter losses. So if you're supplementing that natural lactic acid bacterial population with strains selected to do a specific job, and these strains have been optimized and selected to produce lactic acid to rapidly decrease that pH, you'll do that more efficiently, faster to reduce your losses within your fermentation process.
This is the whole maintaining is gaining, because the faster you can do all those things,
Absolutely.
faster you can preserve your crop and you're not ending up in a bad position.
It's like naturally, it's like 14 days would probably be your...
14 to 21 day window. Absolutely.
And we're trying to do it in 4.
Sure. Okay. And it seems to be pretty good success there, correct?
Yes. And then you're also giving no chance for these negative bacteria that are in soil, are in the plant. They're not going to do what you want them to do. They're going to use the energy. They're going to produce something, but it's not what the cow can use. So that's pretty important that way. And research has shown that it's usually we're at 3 to 5% energy gain from using inoculants. Inoculants are fairly cheap when you consider it, and the gain is pretty significant when you look at it.
So one of the things I want to capture here too is that what happens when we don't do the silage process well, and what some of the risks we run and what that can do to our cows and cattle.
On the feed outside, the big problem with if you feed spoiled feed to cows, you introduce a lot of bad things. My favorite word to say is vomitoxin. And it's like, boy, does that describe exactly what it means? But anytime you're feeding lesser quality feed to an animal, you can introduce diseases, infections, bacterial type things. Anything that's going to put stress on the animal is going to take away from either milk gain or beef gain. That's diverting energy from doing what it's doing to fighting something. Just like in humans, if you get sick, you use a lot of energy fighting that disease instead of just being a healthy human.
Yeah, and not only to your point, Alex, the molds that can grow to produce different toxins or pathogen growth negatively impacting health and performance, as those yeast are increasing during that feed out phase, utilizing nutrients, there's some recent research out of University of Madison showing that feed is actually less digestible. So as yeast levels go up, less digestible feed, which is decreasing digestibility, ultimately decreasing profitability. So not only when we think about feeding those low quality feeds negatively impacting the cows, but also if you have a bunch of mold or spoiled feed that you're pitching off, to Alex's point, to right when you chop that crop, you have the most value. Don't you want to retain as much of that crop as you can? Maxie said earlier, maintaining is gaining, right?
Yep.
If you're pitching off all your spoiled feed or moldy feed, you're wasting part of your crop. So keep maintaining and gaining.
When they talk about density of packing, the silo, and I think that's just really is about just getting the oxygen out.
So this is just from a actual ensilement process factor?
Yeah. So the one thing that everybody should worry about when they're ensiling is you really need to keep the oxygen out. And if you're not keeping that out, then you're introducing oxygen, which will allow yeast to get back in there. It'll allow some other bacteria that were pushed down. Then you have losses throughout your feed out per ensiling process, which usually is a very long period of time. You're doing it in the spring, summer, fall, and you're not feeding out in the middle till the middle of winter.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have oxygen being reintroduced, and that's a lot why we care about covering trench silos properly. Also compacting that feed down in an effort to get the most amount of oxygen out of there so you can speed up the process of making that silage safe.
Yeah, and that's evident. Like if you ever see the plastic covers and you get a hole in that plastic and then you see all the mold right where that hole is, right? I mean, the oxygen penetrated. The other aspect to that too, Alex, is think about during the feed out phase, you're trying to minimize oxygen exposure and knowing within that first foot or two, oxygen is continuously penetrating that face. So you want to maintain proper feed out rates, knowing that the longer that face is static, the more oxygen is penetrating past that face to a point.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's one of those, I mean, you look at enough bunkers after a while and you think, well, just what they do, but then I guess I don't really think about the oxygen penetrating in and how that can impact it in the long run.
And this is how we get rid of all our extra tires.
Yeah.
Can't burn them anymore.
And that's where the Buchnerite comes in, right? Because with increased acetic acid, you're slowing that process. The same amount of oxygen is penetrating, but it's a less favorable environment for those yeasts to grow and utilize the nutrients within that feedstuff.
This has been another episode of Renk Seeds of Innovation. Thank you to Jesse Thompson from Arm & Hammer for sharing his insights and microbial expertise, and to Alex for giving us a snapshot into the science behind inoculants and what it means for your operation. Today, we explored how silage inoculants aren't just about fermentation. They're a tool for improving feed value and digestibility and keeping your livestock healthier and more productive. We also dug into practical tips around application, dry versus liquid, tank mixes, storage temperatures, and more. At the end of the day, a good inoculant isn't just a line item, it's an investment in efficiency and your bottom line. Don't miss an episode by hitting subscribe and following Renk Seed on social media for more updates on agronomic tips. Until the next episode, I'm Max Renk, and this has been the Renk Seeds of Innovation podcast.
Be sure to hit subscribe for a notification when a new episode drops each month, and follow Renk on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and X. This has been the Renk Seeds of Innovation podcast. Innovating agriculture, one seed at a time.